Welcome to the Transition Discoveries Learning Series. In this video, we're going to talk all things Stage 4 of implementing transition discoveries. Stage 4 can be broken down into two parts. The first part is that your team, in collaboration with youth, families, and stakeholders from your community, will build a systems-level plan containing the actions and activities needed to reach one or more long-term goals. And these long-term goals will be aligned with the priority areas or priority quality indicators that were focused on during your community action planning event. And of course, these were identified by your transition discoveries data. The second part of stage 4 is once you have this plan created, you'll begin collaborating with youth, families, and stakeholders from your community to implement that plan. So let's talk about creating the implementation plan. Your team is going to use the monthly implementation update to transform what's currently in your community vision board into a detailed plan for addressing between 1 and 4 long-term goals. So there may be many long-term goals on your community vision board from the action planning event, and your team is going to select up to 4 of those long-term goals. And in the monthly implementation update, also known as the MIU, your team will identify action steps and activities that link together to achieve specific short-term goals. And what happens is that these short-term goals link together and build together in order to reach those long-term goals you've identified on your vision board. And in the MIU, your team will also plan to address any potential barriers and in particular use those identified strengths from the discovering phase of your community action planning event to address those barriers, as well as measuring impacts of actions and activities both now and then down the road as you get really deep into collaborating on your implementation plan during stage 4. So for a moment, let's talk about the partnerships and supports that you have as you move into stage 4 of implementing transition discoveries. So first, we have communities implementing action plans. This is the core of the work, right, that we were just talking about. And then feeding into those communities by way of information and guidance and resources, we have the Transition Discoveries Initiative. So they are directly supporting your implementation by providing coaching and guidance on the implementation process and strategies you're using to reach your short and long-term goals. Transition curriculum and lesson plans that are freely available to use as you build and expand programs in relation to those short and long-term goals. Youth-focused learning on transitiondiscoveries.org. Resources for transition-specific effective practices, and youth leadership opportunities. And to supplement and provide additional support, you, of course, have your direct ongoing guidance and coaching from TAC, and then additional guidance from that from Patton and the educational consultants. So now that we've talked a bit about the process, let's move into how we actually take these long-term goals from the community vision board and continue to build them out as a team with young people and families and other stakeholders into a comprehensive plan that you can then collaborate on implementing. So all of this additional work on these long-term goals to create a full implementation plan happens in the monthly implementation update under stage 4. So from that first menu there, you're clicking to access stage 4, and then you're going to be seeing these prompts that we're going to look at now together. The first thing you're going to do when you get into the MIU is to copy in a link from your community action plan, your vision board, into the MIU so you have it saved right here. There's a hyperlink to directions to explain how to do that if you've never grabbed a link from a Padlet before. And then once you've done that, you'll be selecting up to 4 long-term goals from your community's vision board. There is no number of minimum that you have to select. You obviously have to select 1 at least, but you can select between 1 and 4, and really that depends on your community and team and what your focus and capacity is as a collective effort. So once you've put your link in there and you've identified how many long-term goals you're going to be focusing on, and keep in mind too that you might start off with one long-term goal and then take on additional long-term goals as you get deeper into implementation. Perhaps the first long-term goal really sets the foundation and the stage, and you can then start working on the other long-term goals after that, because we know that everything is connected. So once you have identified how many goals you're going to be working on, you'll then copy in some of that essential information from the vision board into the MIU. So anything really specific about that long-term goal, what it should look like, what you're trying to accomplish, you're going to copy that information directly into the MIU. You're also going to give the MIU this goal a nickname. So this way, when you're going back and looking in the MIU, it's easy to identify which goal is being talked about, and it pipes that information in so it displays it in different spots for you. So you don't have to read the description of the goal to know which goal is being talked about. So it just makes the process a little bit easier. In terms of planning, though, the second component of this first step is to mark down which of the quality indicators the current goal you're working on is aligned with. So it may be aligned with one or more of the quality indicators, and you're going to identify that there. Okay, so before we continue on into really starting to build out from this long-term goal what our action steps are going to be to reach it, we need to know some key terms to this process. These are things that you likely have been exposed to previously, or the language you've already been using, but perhaps we might be using it in a new way in this process. So we have some terms just to refresh ourselves with and to remind ourselves of. So the first is getting ready. And that's all of that work that happens before you start implementing any action steps. So this is figuring out who's going to do what, where, when, and how. So any trainings that individuals will need to be able to really engage and be empowered in the process, whether it's young people, families, or stakeholders, resources and supports. It's getting everything you'll need before you get started. So that's going to look different for every community and every goal that's being worked on. But the key thing to remember is that you really want to have a clear idea of who, what, where, when, and how before you start anything, and make sure you have all of the resources or all that you can possibly get for what you're trying to do before you start any implementation. So that's that getting ready. After getting ready, we have a few additional terms here. We have actions, and that's simply something that's done once and results in an outcome. So you provide a training or a learning opportunity to young people, and after that, they're ready to engage in something new as part of this implementation process. So it's a single event or opportunity that does everything it needs to do, and those young people, families, or stakeholders leave with that outcome that they came for. And in contrast, activities are multiple actions that are linked together to expand really the depth or scope of an outcome. So maybe doing it once gets you this particular outcome, but activities are multiple things that happen together. So a great way to think about this is perhaps you're providing an opportunity for young people or families, and rather than doing that once as one workshop or opportunity, it becomes a series. So that workshop series or that leadership or mentoring series, whatever it may be, would be activities that are linked together. So In addition, once we have figured out these actions and these activities, so whether it be a one-off or multiple actions together, this mix of actions and activities, we call these action steps. So this is a fancy way of saying all of those actions and activities linked together that are going to get you to a shorter long-term goal. That's what the action steps are. And of course, the short-term goal is then the result of the action steps. And the long-term goal is the result of achieving the short-term goals. So a little bit different, right? So the short-term goal is what comes of all of these action steps, those actions and activities that we combine and collaborate together on. And that results in our short-term goals, but our long-term goals are the result of reaching those short-term goals. So here's just an example to put it all together for us for how this works. So we're getting ready, we're building our capacity for implementing anything and everything related to reaching this long-term goal. We are figuring out our activities and our actions. We are then combining those into these bigger action steps, right? This sequence, this process that we're going to be doing in order to reach these short-term goals. And by doing these action steps for the one short-term goal, action steps for the other short-term goal, those short-term goals combine together and they end up reaching that long-term goal. So let's continue on a little bit more about how we might create action steps for a long-term goal. So addressing the long-term goal begins with your team really task analyzing the chain of actions required to achieve that long-term goal. So, and in that, breaking it down, if you have this chain of actions that you need to accomplish to reach that long-term goal, what are those benchmarks or halfway points? Those are your short-term goals, right? So this is simply referred to as your action steps. One way to think about this as your team is creating your action steps is you might phrase this and talk about it and write it as first we'll do, then we'll do, next we'll do, or step 1, step 2, step 3. It really depends on how it makes most sense to your team and community. But no matter how you talk about it, this information is really going to serve as the detailed, specific directions that will be shared out to all implementation members. So all young people, families, and stakeholders who are going to be deeply involved in this process with you, these are the directions, this is the roadmap that they're going to be following along with you as you implement this together. So that means that you have to be really clear about what's going to happen, who's going to do what, when, where, and how. So to put a little more context to this about what action steps might look like or how they might be focused. So I preface this by saying that your action steps and your long-term goals are going to be specific to your community. So everyone's goals and action steps will be different, and they're going to be fine-tuned to the strengths, goals, needs of your community. That said, you may find yourself focusing specifically on actions and long-term goals that are focused on families or young people. And that's going to be collaborating and empowering young people and family members. So you may have action steps related to supporting the knowledge of families, the resources and access that they have related to transition, and really being integrated decision makers in the district and community about what transition looks like, having the information that they need to support and empower their young people to be empowered to take control and to really lead their transition and their goals and their progress towards their goals after high school. You may be working on action steps for collaborating and empowering with young people to reach their goals, like we were just mentioning. So whatever those action steps are, you're going to want to make sure that you're still thinking about it in terms of first we'll do, then we'll do, next we'll do, or step 1, step 2, step 3. So just as an example, let's say we wanted to create a youth leadership network in our community. We would have to figure out each of those steps and really break it down from the very beginning. If we want to do that, each specific step, who's going to do what, what's going to happen, how are we building this and empowering young people, how are they being decision makers in this process. So keep in mind too that whether you're focused on empowering and collaborating and supporting young people, families, or stakeholders, you really need to make sure that you get really specific and really describe what those action steps are for whatever those short and long-term goals are. In terms of where you put this information, you'll be putting all of that information in the MIU. So all of the things we've seen so far are another section of the MIU here. So as you're scrolling down the page on the MIU for stage 4, you'll then come across this space where you're able to type in your action steps. So each of those individual steps and that you're going to be taking, those activities in order to reach that long-term goal. Once you've identified your action steps towards that long-term goal, you're going to need to identify resources to accomplish those action steps. So you've got a clear picture of what's going to be done, who's going to do what, where, when, and how, right? And now you're going to be thinking about, as a team, collaborating with your TCAT, of course, and your young people and families in your community to figure out what resources do we already have in order to accomplish these action steps, and what do we need to still get in order to do them. Your first thing you should look at in order to find this information is look back on your vision board under the first step of that vision board process. And if we think back, we remember that first step is discovering. So look back on discovering, the first step of your vision board of the community action planning event, and look back and see all of those rich resources, partnerships, and opportunities that are already available to support this priority area, this long-term goal. And put that information in here. And then from that, continue to talk with your TCAT and with your community members about what other information do we have out there, partnerships, resources. Continue diving deep with them to figure out what's already out there to support these action steps. And once you've done that, so where are we still missing resources? What do we still need to accomplish this? How are we going to address that? In particular, how can we leverage these already existing opportunities and resources that we do have in order to build on things that we don't have but we need? And as you're doing this process and looking back on your vision board, and you identify maybe some things that haven't been found yet or identified in your community that you need in order to really be successful for these action steps, your next step is to always go to the Transition Discoveries website and really explore that resource hub. It's likely that between your vision board and the Transition Discoveries website, you'll find most of the resources you need to implement your action steps. So, in addition to figuring out what the resources are going to be, also, what are your strategies for using those resources? And in particular, how are you going to provide training, mentorship, guidance, and support to young people and families, stakeholders as well, to really be empowered leaders in the process of implementing these action steps? So remember, it's not just the LEA team who's going to be implementing these action steps. This is a community effort. We need to make sure that all of those community members involved, particularly young people and families, have all of the information and support they need to really be empowered leaders in this process. Success is really driven by how engaged young people and families are in this process. It's really the secret to success in this entire process. The next part of the MIU, as you continue to build out this plan, is doing a strategization around what are some factors that are impacting our action steps that we've identified? So we know what we're going to do. We've identified some resources, and we've thought about how we're going to really empower young people and families in those action steps to really be leaders and integrated members of the implementation process. And now we're going to be thinking about, so what are some additional factors that might influence us as we're implementing these action steps? Keep in mind that there are many, many potential factors, and some, many, or perhaps none of these factors may be relevant to your plan because the plan is going to be customized and specific to your community. So we do have some potential implementation factors here. In the dropdown on the MIU, you'll find that it's on a scale from them being a very high positive factor, something that's really going to support implementation. On the flip side there, the opposite could be that maybe this is something that might be a significant challenge to us that we're going to have to address. And as you're looking here just for a moment, you'll notice that these implementation factors are all about the system, right? So how the system is influencing individuals to be able to be empowered to implement this. So these factors may be relevant to your plan, they may not be, but it's important to consider them and really to take them in consideration with your action steps. So for any of those implementation factors, whether they be really supportive or potential challenges, you're going to be writing some additional information down below. So for any factors that are strengths, how's your team going to leverage those factors to support the action steps, right? That's our natural next step there. And how can they be used to address the potential barriers? So be strategic. If something is going really well, how can you leverage that, adapt it, expand it, use it in a new way to address some potential barriers that you've identified? We want to, as much as possible, leverage what's already there because we know good work is happening. Maybe use it in a new way, use a resource in a new way, link up things that are great but have never been linked up before to make the sum of them even better than they were by themselves. And for any of those potential barriers, who's going to be impacted and how? And how are you going to mitigate and remove those barriers so that young people, families, and stakeholders are empowered and you reach your short-term goals and your long-term goals? Of course, if you have any other potential positive factors or potential challenges or barriers, you'll be writing those down as well and really strategizing about that. So step 4, measuring impact, short and long term. So now that you have, if we think back, we've figured out what our long-term goal is, we've identified really specific action steps to reach that long-term goal, we've figured out the resources we're going to need in order to implement those action steps. We have thought about some factors, both positive and challenges, related to those action steps. And now we're going to be thinking about impacts, short and long term. So how are you going to identify what's working over time as you're implementing these action steps? So what tools you're going to use to measure these short-term impacts or these long-term impacts? So the tools will really depend upon your team and your goals. Keep in mind that it doesn't have to be data in the traditional sense. These can be running notes and reflections. These, for example, if you're giving learning opportunities and trainings, you might have individuals reflect on what they've learned from those opportunities or things that have happened in their life. That is measuring impacts. It doesn't just have to be numerical, quantitative data, right? It can be this qualitative written data, a narrative that explains what's happening. So maybe that's how you're going to be measuring impacts. Whatever it is, you're going to want to identify that ahead of time. And the reason for that is you just don't want to implement all the way through and go through all your action steps without having a way to measure if what you've done works before the next thing happens. So we don't want to have situations where something in an action step has occurred, but it didn't have the impact that it needed to have, and then you're going to move into the next part of those action steps. But in reality, you are missing pieces now. So the next steps, it's a snowballing effect, right? So you want to make sure that along the way, each of the things that you're doing have the impact that you intended, and you're keeping track of that and really measuring it, so that before you go on to the next step, you know for sure that the capacity is there, that the resources and opportunity are there, and the impact and the skill building and connections are there to do that next step. We know that everything builds on everything else, so you've really got to have, in what is often called a formative way to measure, right? Over time, we're going to be measuring these impacts and progress monitoring, right? What's going on and how our actions are resulting in our desired outcomes. So this final step of the MIU is now we're just going to dive a little bit deeper into progress and impact tracking. So before you start measuring impacts and progress, right, you have to find out how you're going to do that. That's the previous step. So the previous step we just talked about is not what you gathered, but how you're going to gather it, your strategy for measuring impacts. And here is where you're going to put your summary of those impacts. So like we said, it may be reflections and notes from young people and families about their experiences and how their lives have changed as a result of implementing these action steps. It may be numerical data in terms of how many more young people have reached a particular goal that they wanted to reach, or opportunity, how many more people are engaged, whatever it may be, because the goals are going to be so diverse across communities. The thing to remember is that you have to have a really clear idea of how you're going to measure impacts, what types of impacts you want to measure, and then this final step of keeping a running record of those impacts. So what is happening each month? What are our impacts? So in month 1, we did this, and this was the outcome. In month 2, we expanded upon that, and now we've seen that outcome increase further. We're seeing that our young people and families are learning this new skill, that they're having these new opportunities because of what we did the previous month, and your team really being able to see how things build over time. And the reason for this is if you're able to see how impacts are evolving over time, you're able to, in as real time as possible, really shift course. So if you're seeing things aren't quite going as expected, and maybe the outcomes and progress isn't quite what the team and the community, importantly, had hoped for, you're able to look back and say, well, during month 3, we were doing this, and we saw that maybe that particular set of actions really didn't hit to the outcome the way we needed them to, so we can revisit that. And this is your way to kind of have an archive of what was done, what the impacts were, so you can keep continuously improving and adapting and really being reflexive of what's going on in as real time as possible. That's a key strategy of implementation, that it's not one step and done, but everything builds, and you really have to always be thinking back as a community, your young people, families, and stakeholders, your TCAT, your LEA team, about how everything is connecting, how things are influencing other things, because remember, this is a systems level approach. You as a community are focusing on a systems level priority and addressing that through systems level activities and actions to reach that systems level long-term goal. So let's quickly review this process we just talked about. You're going to select a long-term goal from the community's vision board. You're going to be creating action steps for that long-term goal, identifying resources for those action steps, addressing potential barriers, and most importantly, those factors that are going to support the action steps and how they might really contribute to reducing any potential barriers. You're going to be measuring impact, short and long term, and what you're going to measure, how you're going to measure it, and keeping track of that, so you can always have information on hand about how things are going, and you can really pivot as needed to make sure you reach those long-term goals. And you'll repeat that process for all of the long-term goals you select. And keep in mind, as you mentioned before, that you may start off with one long-term goal, and as the system continues to build, you may take on additional long-term goals afterwards. You can work on multiple long-term goals at the same time, and this really depends upon each community's capacity and what their priorities are. Finally, but most definitely the most important part of this entire process, because success really lies in engaging youth and families as implementation leaders. This is really the core of success for the implementation process. So, how do we do that? How do we engage them in this process? Well, first and foremost, just ask them to be involved. We often don't take that presumed competence, that perspective that young people and family members are experts in transition. They have knowledge to share. They have resources and skills to contribute to this process. How would they like to be involved in this process? Simply ask them if they'd like to be involved and how. How do they envision themselves being leaders involved in the implementation process? Focus on their strengths. So help them to identify areas of implementation that really cater towards their strengths, and get them engaged with the team to contribute towards those actions. Break it down, give them smaller steps. Start small and build bigger over time according to their strengths and their needs. Make sure to ask them what they need help with. Scaffold their engagement and the support that you give them. Make sure you offer stories of success for other young people and families who engage in this process as advocates and as implementation leaders. Keep in mind that implementation isn't a short amount of time. It happens over months and months, right? So over that time, different young people and families will be involved in different ways. They may not be involved through that whole process, but you'll have plenty of stories to share with those who are newly involved with what this might look like, to really empower them and let them know that they are integral and they can really drive this process. So know that it's going to be okay for young people and families to make mistakes in implementation. This is not just driven by the district, that they are going to be leading this process with you. And just like you, they make mistakes too, and that's okay. Everyone is learning through this implementation process because everyone has an equal hand in it. Everyone's going to be equally responsible. Keeping in mind that we're going to scaffold those responsibilities to their strengths and needs. And make time to engage them, prioritize them, put them first in this process. And if you're looking for more ideas for how to really engage young people and families as implementation leaders, there will be ongoing opportunities in the Transition Discoveries community of practice and all of those related resources on transitiondiscoveries.org and our implementation courses and our community of practice, Padlet, and all of those resources and places that we share this information. Continue to tap into that community of knowledge about these strategies. So this concludes our video on stage 4 of implementing transition discoveries. We are so excited to see what young people, families, and stakeholders in your community do when they're empowered to collaborate on core goals and to really leverage their strengths in order to do things that otherwise wouldn't have been possible.